Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, today I am joined by none other than Rudy and Jordan from the Glad Trad podcast. Glad Trads, so happy for you to be here today. How you doing?
We're doing fine,
Great.
sir. Thanks for having us.
No, my absolute pleasure. I'm absolutely delighted to have both of you here. I thought that maybe there was one stage where I thought due to some logistical difficulties, I was only going to be able to get one of you, but I've got a 2-for-1 deal today. So my day is good and I hope yours is too. So the way that I'm planning to run today, I want to hear all about who are the Glad Trads, what do the Glad Trads do? And then I want to hear about your personal Catholic journeys, both Jordan's and Rudy's. But I think it would be a little bit interesting for your fans as well as mine who are probably getting to know you. Tell us about some things that they may not know about the Glad Trads. So when you're not podcasting, what are you doing?
Married for 3 months now. We got married June 5th, my wife and I. She has not run away yet. Very, very interesting. I think it's because of the tracking device I installed, but I can't be certain. So that's that. So on our channel, of course, because it bleeds down a lot. So if you were to go back to like the first of our content, both Rudy and I are not married yet. You were just engaged at the time, and I was still just courting my wife. And so it's funny, like this kind of evolution from becoming husbands, and Rudy's just become a father. So that's like the biggest vocation. And real quick, in my own life, I'm classically trained as a cinematographer. So Rudy and I are in sister fields. Rudy's a photographer by trade. And so that's how we kind of met. I was out in Los Angeles seeking my fortune. And what's funny is I've done the whole circuit of really in the independent field, but still, you name it, features, web series, corporate, commercial, that sort of thing. Own my own cameras, love gear, love lenses. But I'm currently working as senior editor at the Augustine Institute, back home in Colorado, thank God. So if you or your parish have a forum subscription, any of the sacramental series, any of the short courses, anything like that, chances are you're probably seeing some of the work that I'm contributing to, which is actually really fulfilling because essentially Jesus was like, good, you can work for me now. And I was like, all right, Lord, that's fine.
Amazing.
And you can enjoy it.
Oh my gosh, you can enjoy it. Yeah, you don't have to. The funniest thing about working in Hollywood is that for all the things that you shoot, there's always a distribution pipeline. Like you want your stuff to mean something. You don't want to just go from like fix to fix. So it's nice like working on things and being like, oh yeah, this has a very particular point. Like this can help teach and spread the faith as best as we can. So that's uber exciting.
Winning. And I understand that you are both pipe smoking enthusiasts.
Yeah.
Do you have a pipe nearby, Rudy?
So
I don't. I don't
maybe
have but I have
I'll
some matchsticks here.
I'll throw this one to Rudy because as with some like little nuanced hobbies, they can generally open up into a world that can just blow your mind. So my passion, my interest outside of, whatever the heck it is I do on a day-to-day basis is wine. And some people look at wine as they go, that's just a beverage that you drink with dinner or something. Whereas to me, it is a world of culture, color, creativity, la-di-da-di-da. I'll become a romantic in a second. Tell me about pipe smoking. What is the world of pipe smoking like?
Well, being a wine aficionado, that is, it really is an art. I mean, when you look into the
enthusiast,
well, one day, I don't know, one day you just become one. I don't know. What I mean to say is that, you're absolutely right about wine because it really is an art form. The way that people extract flavors from certain grapes and like all the varieties and stuff. And I think
it's a California thing to say.
I think there's something similar to be said about smoking tobacco pipes because you do sample the world of different flavors of tobacco. Oh, Jordan's got his pipes. I don't have mine with me right now. They're in the other room. But it's just one of those things. I actually picked it up from Jordan one day. Is actually 4th of July. Jordan used to have this home with a pool, and he would throw a pool party every 4th of July. And as an American, I don't know, it might seem strange as an Australian person, but Fourth of July is a very big deal. Like you have to get together. It's almost like a religious rite, actually. You know, you have to like get together, have a hot dog and a burger grilled on the grill. So anyway, that particular Fourth of July, he had these little corn cob pipes, and he was introducing people into pipe smoking, and I enjoyed it. I didn't really like it all that much, but I enjoyed it. And later on, I just thought, you know what? I had tried it when I was 18 years old, and I didn't know what I was doing. I'm going to give it a shot again. And I haven't looked back. It's a great way to relax and unwind.
It is. It is. So Jordan is the evangelical pipe smoker, and Rudy is his disciple.
Yeah,
I didn't realize that I was the one, you know, with like the peer pressure. I was that kid, you know, in high school that you were always warned against. Like, hey, come here, you wanna have some pipes? So it looks like there I am. No regrets. No regrets.
Terrific.
It's a very gentlemanly thing to do.
I actually, so I've got a pipe. I smoke it irregularly, but on big occasions. I purchased it from a great little, I guess you'd call it a gentleman's store in the more traditional sense in Kansas City called Diebels. You go in there, sports memorabilia, pipes, cigars, the tobacco in the air. It's one of those shops that you go into and you go, this is an experience. Such a cool little place. Question, Jordan, can you retrieve the pipes that you had before?
Yes, sir. Okay.
You know what? While he does that, I'll grab mine.
You better grab yours.
Can you give me, the viewers, and maybe even the listeners, a crash course on the anatomy of a pipe? And more particularly for my question is, those were 3 different pipes, 3 relatively different shapes, different characteristics.
And there's another one too.
Yeah.
So
why? What's the difference? So you got
okay. So I'm such a pleb when it comes to the names of things, right? I mean, everyone knows like bowls and stems. And so this is kind of the big thing. So these are my favorite kind of pipes. These are called church wardens. I'm the ones in my office. I have another one. Whoa, I have 6 pipes. Looks like I woke up and that happened. What I like about church wardens is a couple of things. First off, these are complete fantasy peer pressure. If you watch The Hobbit or Fellowship of the Ring or anything,
I was thinking Gandalf.
Exactly what this is. Exactly. Gandalf's blowing the rings and the ship comes through.
Yeah.
So what I love about church warden pipes in particular is that these are, of all pipes, these force you to slow down the most. And the reason why is because you can't just be walking around smoking a church warden. You know, it's long, it's big, you got to cup it. It's because it's a longer stem, it's a cooler smoke, which is really, really nice. And I tend to like more like dessert flavored tobaccos. I have a very lovely vanilla cream tobacco I was smoking tonight while I was taking my dog for a walk. And I was using my Billard pipe for that, which is kind of like the quintessential Sherlock Holmes one. You know, this is like, you know, everything. This pipe, I can't remember the, I'm sure Rudy might remember the cause, but this was actually the groomsman present. So Rudy has this pipe as well. That's what I gave to all the men of my family for my wedding. And again, like, you have to forgive me. I know that some of your viewers are going to be like, wow, for like this guy who made a whole episode on pipe smoking, he doesn't know like all single pipes that exist, but there's a lot of them. The cool thing about these ones is what they're made out of is that the more that you hold it, the material actually changes. So the fluids in your hands, not fluids in your hands, but like the acids and everything in your hands get onto the pipe and will actually discolor it kind of according to how you hold it and everything. So this is like kind of my special occasion pipe. And then the final thing I'll say about this church warden, this is actually handcrafted out of New York. This was my wedding present from my wife. So this is extraordinary. This is the one that makes me feel like Gandalf the most. So our channel, you know, we have an episode on pipe smoking, and one thing that we just emphasize is pipe smoking, of course, doesn't make you a man or anything, but there's a ritual involved that it makes sense that the traditional Catholic, especially, there's a history of pipe affinity. Tolkien had his pipe, you know, there's like the most famous kind of image, and so there's something about like the Catholic gentleman like slowing his life down and contemplating, and you know, tobacco is not mind altering or anything, but there's something about like just slowing down and taking that beat that's really, really important, that we need to reinvigorate back into our prayer life, into our work, into our play and everything.
And you know what? God in the Mass requires incense. And this temple, it needs incense too. So
Yeah,
I like it. I like it.
we take our incense via pipe.
I am going to greatly increase the number of times I use my pipe throughout the year, starting today. I'd say starting now, but I'm not actually sure where it is. I need to dig it out.
Oh,
Rudy and-
no.
Yeah, I know. And I'd actually need to make sure that I've got tobacco. I went through a phase where I regularly smoked it, and it's just maybe not as big a thing out here. America is the land of cigars and pipes, or that's how I found it. Anyway, cool things. Whereas I think it's a real novelty out here culturally. At least that's my experience. So maybe I need to go to a little bit of effort, roll the sleeves up, and find some tobacco.
Oh,
But I'll get around to that. Rudy, Glad Trads, how did that start?
Well, I wish I was keeping track. I can't remember the year specifically, but I can tell you that if you know about the McCarrick scandal, you'll figure out when we started.
Gotcha.
It was around the same time that the McCarrick scandal was coming out in the media. And there was a lot of attention to this obviously heinous and negative thing in the Catholic world. But really, it was just kind of like, the dam was bursting and there was a lot of stuff that was happening and people were starting to pay attention. And so when that scandal happened, Jordan and I were already going to the Latin Mass, but we were feeling this sort of sense of discomfort, sort of a sense that we didn't have peace because everything that we were listening to was just bad news, And that's not to discredit any of that. I mean, it obviously has to come out, and it's a good thing that these things are coming to light. But at that time, we just felt like we were just kind of depressed, and we were experiencing this amazing Latin Mass, and we just wanted to share that with the world. So we were scanning around the playing field, and we kind of found our niche. We found a place where we could share the positive aspects of the resurgence of tradition and the Latin Mass and all of the positive things that surround that the culture of being Catholic nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then you were walking down the street, and this good-looking guy was walking up the sidewalk in the other direction, and you ran into each other, and magic happened.
I think it happened after like a daily mass.
Yeah,
a daily mass happened, and we were walking out, and we said, "Why don't we just start a podcast?" And typically when you say something like that, most of the time you just don't have the wherewithal to start it. But it was easy. Jordan actually is very he's a go-getter. So when we talked about it, he said, "Oh yeah, just come on over." And at that time we weren't doing video, so we were just recording on like a video recorder,
on a little Zoom,
called like a Zoom recorder or something.
Oh
like
yeah.
that.
Mm-hmm.
We had a whole setup. We would, in fact, our very first episode was very funny. As it was, Rudy came over. He was still I think he'd just become engaged to his wife.
Yeah.
And then I was still just dating Jen. So if you listen, what we done is we placed our couch and all these like cushions and stuff in my living room to just dampen the sound, just to record. We're sitting on this couch talking to it, and then the occasion you can hear Ashley cough actually because we had to push our ladies into the other room, so they didn't make a noise. So.
I know the feeling. Podcasting studio. I totally understand where that the Zoom interview stereotype comes from, where tie, jacket, and boxer shorts, that sort of thing. Like, there's a reason I'm not going to give you a 365-degree panoramic view of.
Yeah, don't make a stand up. don't make a stand up because.
Terrific. Me too. I'm actually just going to sink lower down into there's no risk. So just on that point, why a podcast? I mean, there's so many different creative ways, and look. Slightly disingenuous question because we're all doing the same thing, so it's all something that we enjoy. But I think it's quite an interesting thing to talk about. The technological age that we live in. It's a very particular form of, you could almost call it advocacy for what it is that you're trying to promote. But what was it about that particular medium that appealed to both of you?
I'm sure that there's a different angle. Rudy might hit on it. I know that we wanted to do something that wasn't going to be like, as you know, the nice thing about podcasts is that you build your studio or kind of the equipment that you want to use, and then there's an ease of access kind of factor with the amount of content, right? So it wasn't something that was going to take away from Rudy's work or my work, It wasn't something that needed a ton of, it was something we wanted to make sure we had a high quality right out of the gate with, but also something that we knew that we could just sit down and get to the fundamentals. That's also why we kind of did our homework on determining to start to do a video segment, because that's a lot of my world, but I also know that extrapolates, as you know, the kind of work that you do. When you're audio, they can't see what you're using to dampen and sweeten your sound with. It's just kind of there. And so, but I think also, just stepping away, we're kind of in a revolution of podcasts and of long form conversation. Growing up, I remember people saying, well, people today only have the attention span of 3, 4, 5 minutes. Mm-hmm. The news segment, right, where people are not really debating, but they're just talking over each other for a whole 2-minute segment. And now it's commonplace for us to be driving to work or listening to something, and there's always a podcast or an audio book or audio production going on in some capacity. People want to have deep dive conversations into big topics, and they don't want to just do it on a 30-second segment or something. So I think podcasting has allowed for Rudy and I to get our opinions and our thoughts out in a long format, which has been very helpful. Just kind of because we're honestly, a lot of our conversations most of our conversations, like we do in our podcast, happen off camera, right? I mean, it's not like we're putting on an act for just our show. Our text threads, our phones, our face-to-faces is filled with the exact same stuff. Probably just a little more toned up because no one's on us. So, but there's just such a beauty, especially about the Catholic faith nowadays. I mean, there's such a revolution in wanting to have the images of the church, the images of the faith, the images of the mass, evident by like the Mass of the Ages documentary. Mm-hmm. But there's also just this desire for people to both get their experiences out there, as well, it seems, to really sit down and enumerate on entire conversations that didn't exist or didn't seem to exist for a lot of us a decade, 5 years ago, however you want to extrapolate that time.
Mm-hmm. To my mind, it almost seems like it's the response to mainstream media delivery. If you go back to the framed, choreographed interview, where you can see the artificiality of it just dripping off the screen or from the audio device. Take a show, for example, that the Joe Rogan Experience, the #1 podcast in the world, rough as guts. Not sure I'd want to sit down and have a beer with the guy myself. But what really struck me about that production was how raw the conversations were. And I think that's a big thing. But podcasts are just shooting through the roof in terms of the traction that they're gathering. And I think it's because it's people getting together to sit down and really have a civil, polite conversation that they're all genuinely interested in having. It's a genuine exchange of ideas, as opposed to really, pardon the cliche, but fake choreographed conversation where there's really nothing happening other than the pushing of a pre-established agenda that they're just trying to sort of in a sophist way just weasel it out there in an appealing package.
Yeah, I think also we and a lot of other people too have a genuine love for the church, for Holy Mother of the Church. And growing up in LA, we had just kind of like the worst experiences of Catholicism. I mean, the Catholicism in the 80s and the 90s in Los Angeles was pretty bad. Jordan can tell you some horror stories about that. Not that he lived here, but that he actually researched. Mm-hmm. And so we kind of like grew up with this banal experience of the church. And now that we've discovered our patrimony, we just want to share it. We want to share it with the world and get people to experience that too. We want to have people fall in love with the church again.
Mm-hmm. And Rudy, that's a great segue, I think, into exchanging our personal stories, and that's something I really want to hone into. That's the bread and butter of my production here, is talking to people like yourselves and determining why, given your life's narrative, given the world we live in, why you both have made the decision to not only remain Catholic, but really embark on this passionate promotion for a marketing word, but that's what it is. You've really taken a very active, passionate position in terms of advocating for Catholicism. So maybe we'll start with Rudy. Born a Catholic, cradle Catholic?
I was born, I could say that I don't know. I wasn't baptized until I was 4. So, my experience of the faith and within my family was always a little bit lacking. I think I remember jumping around between Protestant churches here and there, but my mom and my dad weren't very religious. And I think coming from the perspective of like a Latino family, a lot of the sacramental exchanges like baptism, confirmation, and that sort of thing they're turned into events, kind of like milestones in somebody's life rather than an actual exchange of grace that we receive in the sacraments. And so I was baptized when I was 4. I received confirmation, I think maybe a year later, because I got confirmed in Mexico, so they do it differently there, a different order. So you do baptism, confirmation, then Holy Communion. And I think maybe they do it in other places like that, but and then Holy Communion was a different story. I hate to admit it, but I was receiving Holy Communion sacrilegiously. I hadn't done any of the proper preparation. And when I was about 19 years old, I decided that I wanted to do it the right way. But after that, I did RCIA and finished RCIA in 2012. And shortly thereafter, God had given me this very particular grace, this desire, like a really ardent desire to serve his church. It eventually turned into a discernment for the priesthood. And Providence guided me to that parish where I met Jordan. Funny story, my sister, who's not practicing, told me, hey, you should go to this church. And and it just so happened to be that church was everything I needed at that moment in my life. Mm-hmm. I wanted to become a priest, and there was a lot of openings there in ministry to experience what a priest does. And so that was my discernment. I said, I'm going to do everything a priest does. So I don't agree with most of the stuff that I did now, but in the past, I thought I would do that and it would help my discernment. And I got really involved and got my heart broken a little bit by the things that were happening there. And that sort of eventually radicalized me to be a trad.
Put the rad in rad trad. It's actually right. Glad trad, but yeah. Okay, you could be radical glad trads.
But if I could just add something, not to make it too much of a long story, God's providence is so amazing and beautiful. None of this would have happened if I hadn't hit like the lowest part of my life when I was 19 years old. Those early teen years were very, very destructive and difficult years. And I had to hit rock bottom in the sense that like the things that I was doing at that particular moment in my life were just not fulfilling me anymore. Mm-hmm. And I got to a point where I walked up to a bridge and I thought that was it. I'm just going to jump off. And so everything after that experience was totally the grace of God, just calling me into the church. It's taken so many years to form me into the person I am now, but every step of the way, I can see that God was there and calling me to a deeper relationship with him. And so divine providence, I say, is just a really beautiful and amazing thing. And I thank God for being a Catholic. It's the most incredible thing that has ever happened to me, to really deep dive into the faith and live it out every day. It's amazing.
Divine providence. It's definitely one of those things. I think for the non-believer, it's difficult for them to get their heads around. But once you do get your head around it, it's an enormous comfort in terms of, basic principles. God doesn't make mistakes. God's in control. It looks absolutely horrible, but thy will, not my will, and everything, even though I may not understand it, everything will ultimately not only be okay, but turn out the way it should. In a world as crazy as the one we live in, what would you rather fall back on? Jordan, your turn.
Woo. So, a little bit of a different story from Rudy's. I wish nearly as touching and impactful, but I fear it won't be. So I'm a cradle Catholic, in a funny way, actually. I'm adopted, which I suppose is the origin of my story. I was adopted into my family that I'm with at 2 weeks old, right out of West Palm Beach, Florida. And the reason why I start there is because one of the things that helps define who I am and helps me see how I see myself in the world is that I was literally picked. God reached down and through my parents picked me, not just into the family I'm in, but also very directly into the faith. So I grew up cradle Catholic. I grew up out in the boonies, Hicktown, middle of nowhere. So I grew up in a very small, kind of run of the mill conservative Catholic Novus Ordo. I was an altar server. Became a cross bearer. That's what we called it, because Latin, I didn't even know what that really was. I became a lector at one point. I played trumpet a couple of times for the Christmas Mass. Know that one for sure. I'd grown up and I always believed that the faith was true. So I've never really had a moment, even in my 26 years of life, where I really genuinely struggled with the faith or had a period that wasn't kind of away from the faith. But something did happen that moved me deeper into my faith. I was confirmed freshman year. And so that year or the year before, my family went on a cruise and I became friends or acquaintances with this little evangelical Protestant kid a year younger than me or something. And he licked me in a debate. I mean, the floor was paved with papist blood that night. This the quintessential things. Oh, well, why do you guys pray to the saints? Why do you guys confess to a priest? Can't you, and he's very, very, very Lutheran, right? In the way he was like, I could commit 1 million murders. And I was like, well, what happens if you die? Like, you'd go to hell, because clearly you don't really believe that you're in God then. He goes, no, because I gave my life to Jesus in this once moment, I could commit 1 million murders and I would still go to heaven. All these Bible flipping kind of things. And I remember going to bed that night and I was inflamed and I felt like I'd believed my whole life that the Catholic faith was true, but I didn't know anything about my faith. Like, I was about to be confirmed and I didn't know anything about my faith. And I was mad and I felt like I let God down. So I hit the books. I mean, my dad had really introduced me to Lighthouse Catholic Media Talk. So Scott Hahn, Steve Ray, Patrick Madrid, like all those quintessential guys, they were always in my ears. I was always on Catholic Answers looking things up. I was writing things down. I was just on fire for apologetics, I never wanted there to be a scenario where like I couldn't defend a point in the faith because I just didn't know it. Like, I believed this thing, but I couldn't tell you why I believed it. So at my confirmation itself, the Holy Spirit really grabbed me. And I remember thinking over and over again, this is the faith. This is the faith of the church. And I'm not leaving it. I'm not leaving this 2,000-year-old thing, which is built upon that Jesus himself instituted. So when I went out to Los Angeles, I had beforehand gone to the Traditional Latin Mass a little bit. I love history. It's maybe one of my hobbies, actually. I'm an amateur military historian especially, but I adore history. I think it's wonderful. And so I had I'd known that there were changes around Vatican II. I knew that there was a Mass in the vernacular, and I knew that there was an older Latin Mass. I'd even gone to Latin Mass a couple of times, and I'd liked it, but it hadn't quite clicked. And a couple years into LA, I'd met Rudy and a lot of our friends, and I'd formed a good group of people, which was really necessary because my first 2 years in LA were a struggle for sure. And I remember it was after a particular homily on a Saturday evening mass, and I remember there's a Lighthouse Catholic talk called "I'm Not Being Fed," and I remember looking up to God and saying, "I'm trying so hard here, but like I'm just not being fed, and I'm not leaving the church. I just want to know more." And so I Googled Latin Mass near me, and it took me to the Fraternity of St. Peter's, who at the time was in West Hollywood, borrowing a church essentially. And I went there. It's the latest mass in the diocese. It was a 7 p.m. mass on Sunday, and I heard an asperges for in my own mythos what must have been the first time, and I just started weeping openly. I had realized it was around I'd realized that all my kind of historical and apologetic sort of wants were being fulfilled in a liturgy in a really radical way. And so from that first mass, I was like, I need to know more about the faith of the church as it has been for thousands of years and what that looked like really deeply. And so I'm very grateful to God because I think that God has furthered me in understanding of the faith and deepening my devotion to it, to Christ. And I had to share it. So I would come back to young adult group and I would tell Rudy and some of our other friends, I was like, oh my gosh, guys, like there's this thing called Latin Mass and it's down the road and they're in communion. And I'll tell a really funny story to kind of close, but Rudy, I had been going to Latin Mass for a little bit, and our friend group met up at something that was called Beacon at St. John's Seminary. It was a kind of a young adult mass and meditation and adoration sort of event to kind of also like introduce us to the seminary and just kind of get to know some of the seminarians and all that kind of stuff. And I went to Rudy at the time, and I was like, hey, like it's good to see y'all. Yeah, I've been going to mass with the Fraternity of St. Peter. And Rudy paused, and he was like, the FSSP? I was like, yeah, they're Fraternity of St. Peter. He was like, bro, aren't they in schism? And so it's funny, like I think about these conversations often because our own kind of development and deepening of the faith has shed a lot of light on different perspectives that we've gained and histories that we've delved into. And it's just, so we're both grateful, but I'm very grateful to have found Rudy and have those experiences at that church that we did. And I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for that sort of things.
So interesting, and so much in what you both said that I want to unpack. And I'm going to have to be a little select here because I'm not sure there's enough time in the in the universe to do it all. But interesting point based on what you just said, Jordan. I'm a pretty loyal devotee of the SSPX and talk about a controversial starting point. But I'm a massive believer in being able to sit down and have really fascinating conversations,
now,
exchange ideas.
A bit of a misnomer. I said Fraternity St. Peter, FSSP. Rudy thought that I had said SSPX, Society of Pius X at the time.
Well, there you go.
Now, if you'd ask,
you've found him.
Now, if you were to ask us that question nowadays, I think that we would give a very different answer than what we had been at the time. Myself and Rudy, who hadn't even really gone to Latin Mass at the time, on the fraternity, on the society, and on all the icks and isms that are out there with the church. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Two other things I wanted to just hit on quickly. You mentioned that one of the pivotal points in your life, Jordan, was when you were confronted in a forum where you got your butt whooped for, to say it as you put it. You said the pavement was dripping in papist blood. I had a relatively similar experience. I've mentioned this general narrative a number of times on my show, but I went to a non-denominational secular grammar school for high school. I went to a Catholic primary school. The only option really that my parents saw appropriate for me, given my personality and the facilities available, was this school that I went to, and I had the best 5 years of my life. It was terrific. I've made a lot of very, very close friends. I'm still close with them. But one of the things that I took away from that, which was quite unique, was I consider I got the best Catholic education I could have. Given my personality, it was challenged on a daily basis. And I don't deny the challenges that came along with that. You're in a non-Catholic environment, the world, the flesh, and the devil, that stuff is real. But in terms of being in an environment where you are put on the spot and you are made to think about why you do what you do, couldn't think of a better arena. And that's what happened to me. I remember this one particular occasion where I, as part of a little project at you'd call it a parish youth group that I was a part of. And I'm talking very, very young kids. We were all memorizing a version of Thomas Aquinas's cosmological and teleological arguments. Emphasis on the emphasis on the memorized. Because I'd whipped it. There was this relatively smart aleck guy I went to school with, really nice guy, but he loved a bit of a jibe. And he said, "Prove to me that God exists," or words to that effect. And so I thought, whipped out the teleological and the cosmological, and I started reciting it. And he, very clever, he stopped me and he said, "What does that mean?" And I rote learned it. I could not explain what I was saying. And I was so embarrassed. I was so ropeable. I went home and I thought, that's not happening again. And I think that was just part and parcel of my personality. It was a pride thing. So I think I feel very lucky. It's not that I was burning on fire for the faith and the truths of Catholicism. It was that guy had just humiliated me in public in front of a lot of people who I liked, and he'd won the day. And I thought, gee, no, not again, not on my watch. So out came the books. But something I want to ask both of you now, you've both alluded to certain challenges that you'd faced over the years in terms of your own personal narrative and the way that links into your Catholicism. And I think that's a very valuable thing to discuss on forums like this, because we're in the age of, you could call it mass apostasy. There is so much noise, distraction, temptation that is drawing particularly young people away from, forget Catholicism generally, just the very idea of religion. And there's this massive void in people's lives and souls that is becoming harder and harder to fill. If I could ask both of you, in terms of the challenges that you'd faced, maybe what were they and how did you navigate those? So maybe if I could start with Rudy.
Sure, yeah. I sort of alluded to it when I was in my early teens. There's a sort of lifestyle that you're sold as an American youngster, you know. It's a sort of it's a totally fake thing, you know. It's a construct, you know. It's the kind of life that you watch get what's the word, it becomes a trope in a movie, you know, like, oh, you're a teenager, you got to live out your life this way, and you know, you're gonna fall in love with some girl and it's gonna be amazing, and you know, just kind of like that sort of tropey stuff. But what you don't realize is that if you don't do it a certain way, that one, you can lose your soul, and two, it just completely destroys the reality of any sort of meaningful relationship. Yeah. And so for me, I want to say the biggest thing was having to put all of that away. When I discovered things, you know, what the church taught in RCIA, and I want to say, like, the RCIA that I did, it was still pretty lax in the sense that we didn't really get the depth of the catechism, for example, or really anything. But I sort of did get to a point where I was looking at a wall and I was saying, I'm not going to jump over this wall, or I'm not going to have enough resources to get over this wall unless I actually change my life. You know, sort of these tropey ideas, these tropey goals that I had put on myself that I developed from degenerate culture. I had to put those things away because they were incompatible. And so, you know, one of those, for example, I hope it's not too raw, but just to be real with everyone, and Jordan and I have discussed this on our podcast, but like one of those huge problems was pornography. I mean, pornography is like a destructive force in the culture today.
Yep.
And children nowadays are exposed at a younger age to pornography, and it just completely destroys your perspective of the world or real relationships. So that was one example I can tell you for sure was, as a young man, and I think a lot of people, even women, have this problem. They just encounter pornography and it just completely destroys your life. That was one thing. Another thing was, this idea that I was going to get married, but it didn't have any sort of relation to the church or what a real marriage and family actually properly needs. Becoming a father now, I realize there's no way that I could make this work if I wasn't in the church. It's just too difficult. And marriage itself, you get so many graces from the sacrament. And those are two examples, I think, that were really difficult, and I think are really common for young people nowadays. You're looking for a connection, and if you don't have a proper idea of what connection is in the context of the church and what Holy Mother of the Church teaches, then you're just gonna have a bad time, bad experience after bad experience.
I think it's very very good and interesting that you brought those issues up, because they are real. Hiding from them only further complicates, makes worse the situation. And being able to have a raw conversation about it, I think, is insanely important, because if one goes with the, stigma, smash down on it and refuse to confront what is actually at the core of these issues, these issues are so dangerous that lives can be ruined by them materially. The spiritual, I think we all get that. But spiritually, that's the no joke. But a lot of people, I think, they're only, how do I say this? You have to be hit in the face by something before you will actually appreciate how serious the situation is. The spiritual and the supernatural are things that I think people struggle to connect with, because we live in a world of empiricism where if you can't see it, touch it, feel it, it's not worth your time. And that's not true. But the funny way is that God works with the material. And I've seen it so often that vice can lead you to God will wake you up somehow. Read the story of Saint Augustine, and these are real issues that people have to be able to talk about, and they're the real issues that affect young people these days, which is really, really sad. Jordan, what about you?
So, coming to Los Angeles as a 20-year-old man, I did the most growing up between 20 and 21 ever. I learned more about myself spiritually, mentally, physically than I had ever at any point in my life. Los Angeles it's the epicenter for a lot of very evil things. Rudy just discussed pornography. Well, all that takes place in the San Fernando Valley. We don't even think about that stuff, but that's the reality, that the vast majority of pornography consumed takes place, it's made. I'm very fortunate because when I came out to Los Angeles, I had two rules for myself. I wanted to get paid for my work, and I wanted to be able to show what I was working on to my mom. And for the most part, those two things were true, but not always. And there are a couple of gigs which I have done, which I'm not proud of. Nothing quite to pornography, but just things that are just the more dreg heap of secular materialistic kind of culture. And there was a lot of projects also, and this is what you realize, is the world, the flesh, and the devil. And when you're dealing with a medium such as film, you have to make a decision really fast on what is your point for your character. There are plenty of directors, cinematographers, editors far better than me, far worse than me, but their reels are filled with half-naked girls and drugs and fast cars and faster women, these sorts of things. And because they're visual things, they're pleasurable, especially for a young man, these gigs can pay very well. And you can think to yourself, well, there must be no other option here, so I must take them. And I think what's very sad is that you just find a lot of people who are stranded in this materialistic plane, and they believe sex, sexuality, morality, all these things are kind of reductive, and that they're essentially the price of a handshake. They're a price of whatever your producer's going to pay you on Venmo or in a check. Now, on the flip side, though, there's a lot of good in a place like Los Angeles. Obviously, I think that it being the epicenter for a lot of big evils, I don't think it's a coincidence that that Rudy and I have found tradition to be budding in a place like Los Angeles. The church that are the Church Latin Mass Church that we both went to together got so big that they can't to this day they can't even use the main church anymore. And so what I kind of see is I see how our culture has become so destructive and so selfish and individualistic and materialistic. And it's sometimes really hard when you're on set with people whom you care about, people who just need God, really, fundamentally. And so it's been a struggle for me because, again, like there were times, especially in those first couple of years, where I would go to adoration because I could walk to church and I was like, Lord, either give me something to do, tell me what you want of me here, or send me home, because I can't work in this limbo where like I'm trying to make like a life and also trying to be like a good moral man. I don't want to meet my wife and then have to scrub all these things off my Instagram feed, all these shots that I've done. But you turn down a lot of money in that place. Mm-hmm. You do. And it's not like, I can see why people say the love of money is the root of, why the Bible says the love of money is the root of evil. But man, it's also really difficult when you just need to live in an expensive place and you're going, I can't do that gig.
That is such an interesting point you make. And I think one of the more complex elements to the discussion of vice in general these days, those particular vices prey on people. And I guess to illustrate that point, the difference between somebody walking down the road, a vice of any nature, jumping out in front of them, and then having the abstract choice to be able to, choose or refuse. That's far too simple. That is not how these things work in my experience most of the time. They catch you when you're down, you're going through tough times, you're needing to fill a void, whether it's sadness, it's stress, it's financial difficulty, anxiety, and then you're presented with the opportunities with these vices, and the roaring lion. It gets you, and once it gets you, it's really, really difficult to break away.
Yeah, one thing that I've always been meditating on is this: when Satan comes to Eve, you would think that there would be a grandiose Summa Theologica style debate, back and forth. You would think that would be the approach, but instead it just starts with just a seed of doubt. And I think that in a place like Los Angeles, or any place, of course, anywhere that vice works, there is that gateway where it doesn't seem like it's as big of a deal as others are making it out to be. When Rudy talks about, on our channel, we talk about the dangers of pornography. We talk about it quite a bit because this is an issue. It affects a lot of women too, but this is an issue that it's a silent revolution. I mean, it afflicts so many young men who are Catholic, who really do love the Lord and want to walk with Him, and yet we don't talk about it. We don't talk about it as a negative, because it's just a thing that people do. You're bored, you just need some tension out, whatever it is. I mean, you can justify it ever. And I remember one little story. I'll be quick, but when lockdown happened, Rudy, myself, and a buddy of ours, we were all together in their apartment, and we were actually watching Mass. We were watching the live stream of Mass and going through the motions and everything. And afterwards, we were kind of sitting on the couch talking, and I said, my first exposure to pornography was early middle school with two other guys. So it was three of us, and one of my buddies had it, right? And I was like, this feels like such a cleansing inversion that now there's three guys of us, and we're sitting here doing our best to celebrate Mass. And I'm just thinking about the inversion the devil does on so many things like that, So it's very, very interesting. But yeah, that's been a struggle that I've had to overcome myself, and seeing and being in head on the culture, learning how to be a moral man in a place that is really easy to slip away and be an immoral man.
Mm-hmm. And as I think we've all sort of hit on, we go to these things to fill a void that exists within our soul. you both found over time that Catholicism, traditional Catholicism, went, I'll say, a lot of the way to giving you meaning and fulfillment in your life. Could you both speak to that? So we've briefly alluded to it, but what was it, if we can just narrow in on that point about the traditional form of Catholicism that appealed to you? And Jordan, take the floor.
There is a line from True Grit, the book, not the movie. It's I think it's an American classic. Highly would recommend it. It's beautiful. But it talks about the particular, I think, Judge Parker, or the judge that's in the town, and how at the end of his life he converted to Catholicism, essentially on his deathbed, away from Methodism. The Catholicism had been the religion of his wife. And the writer, what she says is, she says that sometimes a person needs a stronger sort of medicine than a Methodist can make. And so that, for me, has been the greatest analogy of why traditional Catholicism in particular seems to be both so reclamative on my own life. And as I see its kind of growth and promulgation and conversation inside the church, I can see how returning to what our ancestors accepted with our love of Christ in mind, I can see how that's an antidote to a lot of these heresies we're combating nowadays. As the church goes, so goes the world. And so there, as we talk about like the culture just devolving, especially here in the West, it's not enough to be conservative, because we don't even know what we're conserving anymore. We keep moving the goalposts on these things to conserve. It's time to start thinking, as some would say, a little more radical. But I would just say it's time to start thinking as our ancestors really did. You know, when our ancestors thought about Mass, it's not just a celebration about community and all these other kind of things, right? You go on 1,000 churches websites and they talk about how it's a Catholic community, which is important. But if Mass is understood as a sacrifice, that changes the entire scope of what your life in relation to it is. Because as the Second Vatican Council says, right, the Eucharist is the source and sum of the Christian life. So we are by nature liturgical, right? Heaven's described as liturgy. And so therefore we ought to really base our lives around these fundamental truths which Christ laid down about the liturgy, about piety, about devotion, about the fact that he instituted a church for the salvation, the ordinary means of salvation upon the whole world, and that we get to be a part of that. And because these things are instituted by God, we need to be very careful about tinkering them, because they work. Just as when you talk to an exorcist and they say, we do the prayers in Latin because they work. God is greater than the sacraments. God is greater than the human confines of the church. But for us as Catholics, we need to be obedient to the magisterium, to sacred scripture, and to sacred tradition, and learn that our ancestors had it right. And so many times it's been such a cure for so many things. And now in my marriage, because we did the whole Latin Mass, we did traditional pre-canon, we read traditional books, everything. Learning about how marriage is supposed to be, how God intended it from the very beginning, how I should be as a man head of my household, how my wife should conduct herself as my wife. It is completely revamped how we look at the world and how we look at the culture. So for me, that's what traditional Catholicism genuinely offers for everybody.
Rudy?
I that's an excellent question. I think Jordan hit a lot of really good points there. Not to overly simplify it, I think tradition has been a really like a roadmap for me, you know. Mm-hmm. Because when I got into the church and when I became a little bit more serious about my faith, you know, it sounds kind of like a joke, but it really isn't. The church today is really, at least like the vestige of the church, like the face of the church, is really like, I'm just going to say it. I mean, it's become the Vatican II church, you know. Everything directs to the Second Vatican Council. And you get into some of the documents, you get taught some of the ideas, and they just don't really make sense, especially when it comes to different religions. I remember one time there was, in this young adult group, there's all kinds of different people coming in and going. Mm-hmm. And there was people who would come and then they would say, oh, well, you know, I knew one guy who came around just to see what it's all about. He wanted to see what Catholicism was about. And he kind of hit a wall. He couldn't join RCIA for whatever reason. It just wasn't the season for it. And he went away. And before he did, he told the priest that, he thinks maybe his answer is in a different religion. And the answer he got was, okay, well, if God is leading you there, then I'm sure you'll find God. And so you see these sorts of contradictions.
Why would you bother? And I mean, that normally doesn't trigger me, but what is the point? True. Like Catholicism, it's a religion of absolutes, and you take that away. Why even bother? It holds no value.
That's just one example. When it came to learning more about the tradition of the church and being really involved at this parish and seeing the way that the liturgy was done, it just didn't make sense. I tried my best to change things as much as I can, but I'm a lay person. It's not my responsibility to do that in the first place. And I just kind of kept hitting this wall. I didn't understand it at the time, but it's the Church of Vatican II, and I knew that there was a magisterium that was much older than that. And it just didn't seem like there was a continuity between what we see now and what has always been. And I think I had to look at it from that perspective, because I did go to a traditional Latin Mass one time before that, and I thought it was wonderful. I thought it was beautiful. I just had like the typical experience, like I didn't know what I was looking at. I was trying to fumble through a missal, and it didn't make sense for me at the time. But afterwards, I had learned enough to say, this is actually right, proper worship of God. The liturgy is actually pointing to deeper realities that we believe in, that the church claims to believe, and that the laity are obliged to believe, and this is it. And I just fell in love with it. It was such a radicalizing experience. I don't want to diminish that word, but it was such a radicalizing experience to see it in action and to be a part of it, that I said, I just can't be a part of this church anymore. That this Vatican II church, I just can't do it. And I don't want people to misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm not saying that there's, two different churches or, this kind of schismatic mentality. It's just that there's a disconnect. And nowadays you have to, Jordan made a video about this. You have to be either hot or cold. If you're Catholic, be Catholic, but it's very hard to be Catholic in the church nowadays.
Yep. And I want to take the two questions that we've previously discussed and sort of try and tie them together. And this will be something that's probably more relevant to somebody like myself, cradle traditional Catholic. And if
that's amazing, by the way.
Luck of the draw. God was good.
Lucky. What the heck?
God was good to me on both sides. Mum, dad, different sides of the world, families completely unrelated. Thank God, because they ended up getting married. But both were traditionally Catholic. What are the chances of that? But with that, from somebody like myself, I'm far enough down the line to have really not experienced that initial war for tradition that apparently took place back in, this after the Second Vatican Council, 70s, 80s, all the way through, and it's starting to rear its head again today as we're seeing. But put that context aside, and you grow up in what people may see as an austere practice of religion, because if you take away the substance of Catholicism and you leave behind a set of, church law, church commandments, do's and don'ts, that's all that a lot of people see. And I think very unfortunately, that's all that a lot of young Catholics see, because for one reason or another, they're not exposed to, or they don't actually understand the substance that underpins it. And why I love talking to people who came to traditional Catholicism, they found it and they chose that over some sort of alternative. They've engaged in that intellectual exercise of identifying what it has to offer you. But we have sort of unpacked that to some degree. Something that I find interesting is discussing the idea of bringing the will into conformity with the conclusion that your intellect reaches. Time and time again, I've experienced this personally. I've spoken to close friends or just other young Catholics who, you know, sitting there and they have that moment where they go, I know what it is to be Catholic. I know what I need to do. I've invested enough in it, but I just don't feel like I'm there. Either my prayer life is gravely lacking, my personal life, I'm just not living in accordance with what I know I should be doing. The will's not there. And from a cradle Catholic perspective, I think that's, to my mind, it's kind of inevitable, because after a certain amount of time, you can no longer take these things for granted, because the essence of them isn't something you can take for granted. You're gonna reach that point in time where you have to appreciate it. You have to get your hands dirty. You have to pull it apart. And you have to go, wow, this is really a gem that I've got. And you have to sort of engage in that conflict. What was that ever an issue for either of you in terms of the struggles that you had as adolescents, and then maybe even in your early forms of Catholicism, sort of steering yourself in the direction of, I want to live a better Catholic life? Jordan?
I mean, the easiest example and the obvious example for many guys is, of course, pornography. That's like, how many times, you know, I used to call it the 2 week tango, because I would go where confession, and then week 1 would be great, and then in that second week I'd slip up. And you know, and the worst part about it is I knew it wasn't. I'd wish, you know, some sins are born out of really unpacking something kind of deep, you know. This one was a particularly difficult demon to kill for me, because this one was born out of boredom. I mean, idle hands are the devil's playthings, and that's completely true. I wasn't like, oh, I'm mad at this, or I just can't do this, whatever. Like I was just bored. And so that spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. You know, that kind of genuine hypocrisy really, really reigned in me. And I knew, especially becoming, especially when I knew that my wife was the one I was going to marry, I knew I was like, I can't do this. I don't want to, you know, have an altercation, have something, because if I don't kill it now, it's not gonna ever stop. So there, you know, there's times like that where you read about the faith and you read those things that you know are correct, you know, and you know that God gives you the grace to overcome sins in this life. And you also know that it's going to be a struggle, because there's a lot of different motivations for sin. I'm very fortunate because I think that, you know, I grew up like I grew up cradle, and I wasn't traditional cradle, but I grew up with a decent foundation. I really owe that to my parents about the faith and learning the rights and wrongs. And so there wasn't as much gray area growing up that I could even kind of entertain with it. So much of my conflicts on the will and the intellect come motivated from laziness, from sloth, which is a terrible motivator at the end of the day, because I don't think that you can't even make a human justification to yourself about sloth. It literally just comes down, I think, to, I just don't want to do it. You know, prayer life like that for me too. You know, I'm it's easier for me to read about the histories and apologetics of the church than it is to cultivate that daily prayer and also meditations, devotionals. I'm reading through Imitation of Christ, you know, putting down, like, learning, like, okay, no, the things about the faith you need to nurture besides just your intellect, you know. There's soul kind of things that you need to nurture as well. And so it's always a challenge. You know, God gives us different challenges because he rejoices in the graces and the virtues that we gain when we overcome those challenges. And he always supplies us with enough grace to overcome them. And I know that that's key for my life, especially now in marriage.
Rudy?
Yeah, I resonate with what Jordan said for sure. One of the greatest things that I was able to do early on, before even getting into tradition, but it was a time where I was falling in love with the church. And again, this is providence. Divine providence is one of those things that is constantly on my mind. It's just always on my mind. Because God gives us enough grace to save our souls. And if we're in tune with that and we want to work with God, God is going to lead you to places that seem unexpected initially, but later on with more time, you realize how providential those experiences were. And so in 2015, I started working at this e-commerce company. And it's really far away from where I am. I'm not sure how to translate it into kilometers, but it's far. It takes like an hour and a half for me to get there every single day. And one of those things that happens is at that particular moment in time, what was happening was I had a lot of free time, and it was a very lax job. And so, sometimes I would sneak off and I would go to this local parish that was there if I ever needed to go to confession. So I'd go there during lunch. And this particular community is a religious order, and they were putting on this Ignatian spiritual exercises, which is kind of like a modified version of what the actual exercises were. And so I really liked this community because it was really orthodox. And I started doing the Ignatian spiritual exercises there. We actually did an episode with Father Trevor Burfitt, who's with the Society of St. Pius X, and he kind of gave an introduction to what the exercises were. But at this particular parish, and really in all the exercises, I think, you do what's called a general confession. And a general confession, for those who aren't aware, you look at the whole span of your life since the beginning age of reason. So I think it's different everywhere, but I think 5 is generally the age of reason. And you confess all of the sins that you can from when you are now to the age of reason. And I remember confessing things that were still happening in my life. It was just repeating the same thing over and over again. And I realized how awful that was, that there isn't a real firm purpose of amendment. And so that was a really big moment for me, because later on, I was struggling with pornography, just like Jordan mentioned in his own life too. You get to a point where it's like, am I really going to change my life? Like, am I serious when I confess these things? Mm-hmm. Because if I'm not, this is just very disingenuous and I'm really, you're not getting any grace from that confession. And it's in fact invalid if you just have no firm purpose of amendment. And I just got to a point where, with that particular sin and other sins that just kept coming up, like I'm a hothead, and I just have that sort of experience where I feel things a certain way and they're really intense. And I just kept asking myself, like, am I serious about changing my life? Like, am I seriously going to change my life? Because if not, like, I'm not being authentic. And I think that was an important step in becoming serious, just thinking, like, am I being authentic in my search for God and my love for God? I'm doing all these things because sin not only just affects your own personal life, but it affects the people around you, and it most injures God. Yeah. Like, am I serious about this sort of thing?
And if I can just interject there. Oh, yeah. I think that is an enormous point to get out there, because for one reason or another, we can be okay with offending God. He's infinite. He can handle it. That's what leads to habitual, I don't want to call them insincere, because, no passing judgment. We're all human. We're all extremely fail. But the confessions you just described, Exhibit A, made a million of them. But there are some faults that rub off on others. We discuss that. They don't just impact yourself, they impact those around you. And I want to flip this in a way. The Jordan Peterson phenomenon. You know, he took the world by storm, espousing principles that are really the big principles he makes are radically Catholic, every single one of them. The one that seems to be garnering most traction and attention is pick up your damn cross and carry the cross. And he says that with such force, and he gets standing ovations and wherever he goes. And I'm a big fan of the positive impact he's been able to have.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
The necessity of tracing that back to substantive theology, God's word, Catholicism is the integral link to be able to really get important substance out of that. With Catholicism, something that I think it's really important for people to understand is if you do it properly, it can have a positive impact on your life. So there are those maybe the more stoic of us who can go, this life isn't made for pleasure, which is true. You know, we're in it for the long game. It's a marathon. You die, you go to heaven, and you reap your reward thereafter. That is all very, very true. But I personally do believe that in terms of ultimate fulfillment in this life, you will only get that ultimate fulfillment. I'm not talking commercial. I'm not talking fame or anything. I'm talking about ultimate, to borrow from Aristotle, let's call it eudaimonia, you know, that flourishing, the perfect human fulfillment from living a life in accordance with God's law. And that's the challenge, because that is so, so difficult. But can either of you speak to the positive impact that you experienced as individuals when you started, I guess, being truer to Catholicism?
You want to start, Rudy, or shall I?
No, you go ahead.
All right. Consistency is something that people pick up on. And if you present yourself in the dark as you do in the light, not only will our Lord recognize you, but also even those who don't share your faith will recognize you. So there is, I remember this very distinctly, especially from my time in Los Angeles, because I, for a lot of times, would be maybe the only Christian, but certainly the only Catholic on set. You're talking 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 plus people. And I worked with people who I had extremely stark opposing viewpoints on. I mean, the quintessential Hollywood type versus me, traditional Catholic country bumpkin from the center of the country, when you name it. But it was, you could kind of tell with the air that could be carried, that they knew that, all right, Jordan has these no-go zones, these go zones, but he's consistent. He's fair, and he's striving to be charitable and good, and that's because that's what he believes in. And so we're going to respect his beliefs. And so there are a lot of times I can really speak to the credit of caliber of a lot of people working in Hollywood, because I do genuinely think that despite some extremely erroneous beliefs, I do find that there are a lot of them who are extremely kind and generous to authentic viewpoints presented different than their own. So, kind of delving deeper into my faith and that sort of light, it's put me at ease with the world a lot more, because there are just entire scopes of issues and struggles that belief and clinging to the cross I just haven't had to experience. When I met my wife, I knew and she knew. We sat down on our third date and we said, what are we doing this for? Let's start courting and let's date for marriage. And proposed a very short time later, got engaged, did the whole thing. So there was none of the whole hookup culture, broken, sexual deviancy, like anything you name it, dating very intentionally with a Christ-centered relationship. And so that right now is the most fundamentally greatest fruit of the faith that I see every single day, because I wake up to the woman whom God has really fashioned for me in the way that Eve was fashioned for Adam. And being able to look at another person and go, you are my helpmate and the one who's going to help me get to heaven. And, when God blesses us with children, that'll be a great gift. And God uniting us together as husband and wife is a great sort of gift. And having our relationship built around the faith in such a dramatic way that you can just talk about the faith openly and honestly with someone who is fused to yourself in that way. I mean, that's incredible. And I would not. I knew that I had been given such a good head on my shoulders, but really continuing and deepening my faith, I mean, it's just opened complete perspectives on how to be a man and how to be a husband, and God willing, soon how to be a father that I could never have imagined before.
Rudy?
Fulton Sheen talks about how peace, in the world, it never begins as a corporate thing. It always starts interiorly in the individual. And I think that is the greatest thing that I have experienced, is a sense of inner peace, knowing my purpose, what I was made for, discerning my vocation, just like Jordan. We both were called to the married life. And so what that means is we have a goal. Ultimately, it's heaven. But our roadmap has become our means of getting there, is what I'm trying to say, is to be husbands and fathers. If God desires us to be husbands and fathers. That didn't really, I want to say that it made sense to me, for the last couple of years. But now that we have our daughter and that I'm able to hold her in my hands, I mean, the first week was a really emotional week, partly because you lose sleep and all that stuff. And we're kind of used to it now. We don't sleep like we do. And that's just one of those things, you have to get past it. That's just part of the experience. But I remember holding my daughter in my hands and thinking to myself, how long I had waited for this. It wasn't just 9 months. It was my entire life that I had this semblance of what God was calling me to do. I wanted this family, the family that I didn't have, and now that I could hold her in my hands, I can say, wow, this is the way that God intended me to work out my salvation. Not just for myself, but for my wife. My wife is helping me and I help my wife. And we're both working together, praying together to make that happen. And that's just a wonderful thing. You feel a sense of fulfillment that you would not experience if you were outside of the church, because you get to know exactly your position as a created being by God. You understand that God created you to know him, to love him, and to serve him. And there's going to be a really special way for you to carry out that meaning, that purposeful meaning in your life through your discernment. So it's a piece that I never thought I would have. It's really incredible.
Rudy, Jordan, Rudy, this is awesome. I could go on for the next 10 hours, time permitting. I'm sure you don't have that amount of time, unfortunately. I want to take this in a slightly different direction before we close. Spent so much time talking about your individual Catholic journeys, and I think there's just so much that everybody can extract from that. Let's talk a little bit about the traditional Catholic landscape, just in terms of your perspectives coming into it. So this will be interesting because I'm a cradle Catholic. I'm interested in your perspectives as people who found the traditional Catholic landscape. What were your observations when you found it, and how have those thoughts developed over time from then to what we are seeing now? And I promise, after you've answered that, I won't push that button again.
Oh, that'll just be a two-parter. That's okay, because I think we've had a blast. Woo! Oh my, this is the enchilada. I'm going to do my best, Rudy, because I think that you and I can have these two different strains that'll work. Let me try mine. So, first off, I want to say to your audience and to our audience and to everyone listening that the myth of the rad trad I mean, get offline. And if you actually meet people, they're normal people. I mean, that's obvious, right? The virtue of attending a Latin mass does not inherently make somebody hateful and mean. It's actually a very evil, not it's a bit of an insidious slur that has come from the fact that we are all children of what I call a great divorce. Has been this rupture in continuity, and especially in the wake of something like Traditionis Custodes, I think that everyone can sniff it. Catholics who have attended the Novus Order their entire life, Catholics who are in the other accepted rites, and certainly traditional Latin Catholics can all really smell it. And if you go back and just read the history of traditional Catholics, especially of mid last century going forward, there's a reason why a lot of them had, I think, as St. Thomas Aquinas talks about, righteous indignation. Because if you woke up and what the sisters had taught you your entire life is true was suddenly false, and you can't make 2 cents of anything, and there's all this new music and altar rails are gone, and every beauty, goodness, sacramentals, everything is stripped away, there is great ground to be saying that's not okay. And Rudy and I talk about this with the case of Archbishop Lefebvre. We talk about this in the case of just all the things that happened. So again, though, we didn't experience these firsthand. And so this is the landscape we live in now. The digital era, the era of moving away from traditional forms of media, the era of being able to have conversations like this, has helped contribute to what was already there, which is an explosion in the need for legitimate piety, reverence, and truth of the Catholic faith. Truths that have been watered down for, in particular, the last 70 years are now being unearthed. And so it's really exciting for us because we are finding more friends and comrades and people across the whole of the age spectrum who now have just a great deep love of the church, such a deep love for Christ, a love for Our Lady, and a love for the Mass, as the Mass of the ages. And they're happy people, they're normal people. And I think that there are just certain kinds of assumed beliefs of the culture that as a traditional Catholic you can't swallow anymore. To give an example real quick, it's weird. We just had so one of our good buddies now is Nick Cavazos at the Traditional Thomists podcast. And we had him on the show to discuss Catholic integralism, right? The marrying of the mitre and the scepter and what that looks like. I mean, we're talking like medieval trains of thought here. That's not something that Americans usually do. But if you have we've had that conversation with other Catholics, and this is something everyone, because we see the devolution of culture and politics and everything, that people are like, you know what? Maybe my crazy uncle was right about something. Maybe that's worth a look, you know? So there are plenty of glad trads, because our motto on our podcast is risus et bellum, right? It's laughter and it's war. And right now, I think that the way that we can deal with the great scandals, the great apostasies, the great heresies in the church is, you know, to quote Padre Pio, part of it is to pray, hope, and don't worry. And then another great part of it too is just to learn our faith and be prepared to have an answer, to give an answer for our joy, as St. Paul says. And this is what traditional Catholicism is doing right now. The fightiness, you know, the people say, well, it's just hateful and it needs to be clamped down, all that kind of stuff. What you're seeing people who are woken up suddenly and gone, I want to be Catholic because otherwise I'm going to lose my soul. And watered down, mamby-pamby, you know, limp-wristed is not going to cut it. If you don't have authenticity, you know, if you don't have the extra ecclesia kind of feel underneath your sails, it's not worth it. And it's beautiful and it's joyous and it's good when you really fall in to the tenets of the faith as it's been best expressed in traditional Catholicism.
Bravely spoken, Jordan. I'm shaking. Rudy? What, do you have anything to add to that?
Was there a particular direction you were asking, or are you just generally asking?
No. I was genuinely asking, and generally asking.
Just what our perspective is of traditional communities.
Mm-hmm.
I sympathize so much with those Catholics who fought the good fight before us. You know, I'm starting to understand what it is that they were feeling and how maybe they felt like the noose was tightening around their necks. You know, it's hard to be Catholic today, but this is what we want to do. this is what we know is true and what is correct, and ultimately what is going to get us to heaven. And when you find a community like that, it's really, it's like a little oasis that you get to experience as you live and work out your own salvation while you're living in the world, but not being a part of the world. And so those traditional Catholics that came before us, I sympathize with them because, there's, the reason why they called them rad trads is because, yeah, if you just reduce them to nothing, you can just see people who have chips on their shoulders. But it's not that. It's that they were feeling like they were being cornered for wanting to be Catholic. And I thank God that we get to experience that now, because really the line in the sand has been drawn, not just by the world, but also by the church. And we have to stand firm to the truth that has been revealed in the church over the last 2,000 years. And ultimately, we have to be close to Christ. And those communities are bastions for people who are like-minded and who are working out their salvation. I think it's fantastic that tradition has exploded so much that it's so much easier for you to find the Latin Mass, and a little bit easier for you to save your soul.
Mm-hmm. So much insight from both of you there, and especially on Rudy's comment, sympathizing with or empathizing with those that came before. And that's definitely something I feel personally relevant to me and those cradle Catholics like me, because some people look on cradle Catholics or traditional Catholics with a degree of envy. But I think it's definitely a double-edged sword, because you're born with something, you do take it for granted through no fault of your own. You've always had it, and you've never really appreciated it. And you look back and you hear the stories of what people went through in the fallout from the Second Vatican Council and the drastic steps and the very, at times, traumatizing positions that people took in the name of preserving traditional Catholicism. And it's very perplexing. And if I could frame the inquiry that I'm undertaking on my podcast and through conversations like this, it's really why am I personally the way I am, discovered through talking to other people who are similar to me, who have all made the same or similar, been faced with similar decisions to make, and have, navigated them successfully. So very, very interesting, and a very, very important conversation to my mind to be had. Rudy and Jordan, I feel like I've taken up enough of your time. I don't know what the time is where you guys are. I've still got plenty more time on my end, but I think you have been overly generous. I cannot thank you enough for joining me in the lounge room today.
But we thank you for having us on. It was really awesome, and we're happy to meet you. It's really amazing. It's amazing to find other traditional Catholics. It's just it's almost like an old friend that you left behind. It's crazy.
Yeah, I feel bad that we didn't light our pipes and drink a couple of beers.
Guys, that's off air.
Oh yes. Where?
Yeah. But no, for everybody, so that these are the Glad Trads. Like, share, subscribe to their product. So you guys you're on YouTube, you got your podcast. What platform are you guys on?
We are literally wherever podcasts are. YouTube's our main platform, of course, but our audio format, you go on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Castbox, iHeartRadio. You name it, Podcast Crawler, you name it, you'll get us. We are sending it all out to all the corners of the empire.
Damn, you guys are good. So much to learn. I'm just going to keep talking to you guys so I can improve my own product. You guys are the pros. Thank you again. Really enjoy it. and think really enjoyed it. And fingers crossed we can do something like this again in the not too distant future.
Yes, please.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Tom. It was great.
Thank you.